Okay, so today we're going to tackle a pretty fundamental question, really, especially if you're like prepping for exams in philosophy and economics. Uh, what actually makes life good for a person? You know what I mean? Like, what's the stuff that really matters?
Yeah, definitely. And this is a big one, so we're splitting it into two parts. So this time we're homing in on the content of well-being.
Content, huh?
Yeah, so like what are the actual components of a good life? The stuff that really makes a difference.
Makes sense. So, like the ingredients.
Exactly. And then next time we'll dig into the structure of well-being.
Okay, so like
Right.
how we actually like measure it and compare different ideas about what's good.
Exactly. And getting a grip on this content of well-being is really important for understanding stuff like the UP, you
Okay,
know,
what? Sorry.
the utilitarian principle.
Right, of course.
Which is all about maximizing total well-being. But like, how can we maximize something if we don't even know what it is?
Good point.
So our mission today is to like explore those different philosophical theories that try to define, what well-being actually consists of.
Right, because there's so many different ideas about the good life floating around.
Totally. And if you're looking for a really solid summary of all this, plus some practice tests to, really test your understanding,
Boy, helpful.
you can find some great resources over at gradeguru.nl.
Okay, so before we get lost in all the different theories, let's just, make sure we're all on the same page with the basics. Like, what do we even mean by well-being in this philosophical sense?
Right. So in philosophy, when we say well-being, we're talking about what's good for a person in itself, not just as a means to something else.
Non-instrumentally good is the fancy term, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so like money, for example, is good because it can get you things, but it's not good in itself.
Yeah, money is what we call instrumentally good. It's good as a tool to get you other stuff that you actually value.
But the stuff you value, like happiness or freedom or whatever, that's the intrinsically good stuff.
Exactly. And that's what we're focusing on today. What are those things that are intrinsically good for a person? What makes up their well-being?
So we're trying to figure out the fundamental building blocks of a good life.
You got it. And there are actually three big questions we can ask about well-being.
Three. Okay.
First, there's the content question, which is what we're tackling today. Like, what actually makes up a good life?
Right.
Then there's the structure question, which we'll deal with next time. Like, how do we measure well-being and how do we compare different versions of the good life?
Okay.
And finally, there's the subject question, like whose well-being actually matters.
Oh, right. Like, does it only matter for humans or do we need to consider animals too?
Exactly. That's a huge debate in itself, but for today, we're sticking with the content question.
Okay, just had to have that clear.
And one more thing, when we talk about comparisons today, we're mainly talking about comparisons within a single person's life.
Interpersonal, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we're asking, is one situation better for this person than another situation?
Right. So, like, is it better for me to be healthy or sick to have friends or be lonely?
Exactly. We're not getting into comparing well-being between different people, yet that's a whole other can of worms.
Okay. So we're keeping it focused on like different possible scenarios for one person.
Exactly.
Okay. So where do we even begin with all these different ideas about what makes a good life? Like, how can we group them?
Well, a good starting point is to divide them into two main camps,
Think of.
subjective theories and objective theories.
Ah, the classic subjective versus objective. All
Deny.
right, let's start with the subjective side then. What's the main idea there?
So subjective theories basically say that a person's well-being is all about their own attitudes, feelings, desires. It's about what's going on inside their head.
Okay, so it's objective to the individual.
Right. And one of the most famous subjective theories is hedonism.
Ah, hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure.
Yeah, basically, it's the idea that pleasure is good, pain is bad. And that's all that matters for your well-being.
But the more pleasure you have, the better your life is.
In a nutshell, yeah. And for this discussion, we can simplify it even further and say that person A's well-being is higher in situation X than in situation Y if X gives them more pleasure than Y.
Okay, so it's all about maximizing pleasure.
Yeah, but it's important to remember that there are actually many different versions of hedonism. Some are much more nuanced than this, but this simple version is a good starting point.
Okay, but I feel like there's got to be more to a good life than just chasing pleasure.
Oh, there definitely is. And that's where the second major subjective theory comes in, preference satisfaction theory, or PS theory.
Preference satisfaction, so it's about getting what you want.
Precisely. PS theory says that your well-being is higher when your preferences are fulfilled, even if that doesn't necessarily involve feeling pleasure.
So like if I really want to climb Mount Everest, even though it's going to be painful and scary, my well-being is still higher if I actually do it.
Exactly, because it's about satisfying your desires, not just about feeling good.
I see. And this leads to some interesting differences from hedonism, right?
Definitely. Our sources give a good example with the Calvinists.
So Calvin, okay, tell me about him.
So imagine this guy, right? He's super into saving and investing his money. He wants to accumulate wealth more than anything.
Okay.
He might even admit that he'd enjoy, spending money on fancy dinners or vacations.
But he just doesn't want to.
Exactly. He believes it's better to save, and that's his strongest preference.
So according to hedonism, his well-being would be higher if he actually spent the money and enjoyed himself.
Right, because that would give him more pleasure.
But PS theory would say his well-being is higher by sticking to his preference and saving.
Exactly, because it's about what he wants, not just how he feels.
That's a really interesting distinction.
It highlights the core difference between the two theories.
Yeah, one's about the feeling of pleasure, the other's about getting what you want.
Exactly.
So we've got the subjective side covered. Now, what about objective theories? What's their take?
So objective theories are kind of like the opposite of subjective ones. You see, they say that well-being isn't just about your personal feelings or desires.
Okay, so it's not subjective to the individual.
Right. They believe that some things are just inherently good for you, whether you like it or not.
Interesting. So, like, what kind of things are they talking about?
Well, one of the most influential objective theories is the capability approach developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum.
Capability approach. That sounds pretty complex.
It is, but the core idea is that well-being is all about your functionings and your capabilities.
Functioning's capabilities? That's a lot of angs.
I know, right? But stick with me here.
Okay, I'm listening.
So functionings are basically the things you do and the states you're in, like being healthy, being educated, having friends.
Right.
And capabilities are the opportunities you have to achieve those functionings.
So, like, even if you're currently healthy, your capability for health might be low if you live in a place with no access to health care.
Exactly. It's about having the freedom and the resources to actually live a good life.
Makes sense. And where do Sen and Nussbaum come into all this?
Well, they both agree on the importance of capabilities, but they have slightly different approaches to defining them.
How so?
Sen is more into a democratic kind of approach. He thinks that society should collectively decide what capabilities are most important.
Okay, so it's relative to the specific context.
Right. Whereas Nussbaum is more into universal values. She's actually tried to come up with a list of capabilities that are essential for every human being to flourish.
Okay, let's hear what's on Nussbaum's list.
All right, so she says that everyone needs bodily health, like being well-fed and sheltered. They need bodily integrity, like being safe from violence and having control over their own bodies. They need the ability to use their imagination and thought, to think creatively and critically. They need to be able to experience love and emotions, to form attachments and feel a range of feelings.
Wow, that's quite a list already.
Yeah. And there's more. She also says we need to be able to experience pleasure and avoid pain, to use practical reason to figure out what's good for us and plan our lives, to have affiliations with others, to connect with people and feel respected, to appreciate other species and to engage in play, to laugh and have fun.
Okay, so that's a pretty comprehensive list of what she considers essential for human flourishing.
Exactly. And according to her objective list theory, if your life is rich in these things, then you have high well-being, regardless of whether you personally enjoy them or not.
So even if you're like a grumpy hermit who hates everyone and never laughs, you can still have high well-being if you're healthy, safe, and able to think for yourself.
That's the idea behind objective theories. They're saying that some things are just good for us, even if we don't see it that way.
Right. So that's a pretty big contrast to subjective theories, which are all about personal preferences and feelings.
Definitely. And that difference leads to a really important point. With subjective theories, you just got to look at what a person wants or what makes them feel good. But objective theories are saying that people can be wrong about their own well-being.
Whoa. So you might think you're living the good life, but an objective theorist could come along and be like, nope, you're doing it all wrong.
Pretty much, yeah.
But honestly, I'm having trouble seeing how different these theories would actually be in real life. Like, don't we usually prefer things that we enjoy, and aren't the things on Nussbaum's list usually pretty enjoyable too?
That's a really good point, and it shows that there is some overlap between these theories in practice, but the crucial difference is in the underlying reason for why something is good for you.
So it's not just about what happens, but about why it happens.
Exactly. Like, imagine Judith is playing chess.
Okay.
A hedonist would say it's good for her well-being if she enjoys it, if it gives her pleasure.
Right.
A PS theorist would say it's good if she prefers playing chess over other activities.
Okay.
But an objective theorist might say it's good because it exercises her reasoning abilities, which is one of those objectively valuable things.
So they're all saying chess could be good, but for different reasons.
Exactly. And another key difference is that PS and hedonist theories usually have just one ultimate good.
Like pleasure for hedonism and preference satisfaction for PS theory.
Right. But objective list theories like Nussbaum's have multiple intrinsic goods, all those things on her list.
Right. So they're saying there are many different paths to a good life.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a good handle on these different well-being theories, but how does this all relate back to that utilitarian principle we talked about earlier? The one about maximizing well-being. Does it endorse one theory over the others?
Well, that's a really important point to make. The UP itself doesn't actually specify which theory of well-being is correct. It's compatible with many different accounts.
So you could be a utilitarian hedonist or a utilitarian PS theorist or even a utilitarian objective list theorist.
Exactly. And historically, a lot of the early utilitarians, like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, were definitely leaning towards hedonism.
Makes sense. They were all about maximizing happiness.
Right. But these days, you often see utilitarianism being combined with fancier versions of preference satisfaction theory.
Like what?
Well, there's desirability satisfaction theory, which is pretty popular in philosophy.
Okay.
And then in economics, you've got preference satisfaction being used all over the place, especially in welfare economics.
So even if you're not a utilitarian yourself, understanding these different theories is crucial for understanding a lot of philosophical and economic arguments.
Definitely.
Now, our sources also point out that these theories, especially the subjective ones, have some pretty serious weaknesses, some challenges to their ideas.
Oh, yeah, there are some big ones.
Let's dig into those then. What are some of the main challenges for subjective theories?
Well, a classic one for hedonism is the problem of mental adaptation, which Amartya Sen illustrated with his example of Nelson.
Elsa,
He's this guy who's been unjustly imprisoned for years, for speaking out against an oppressive regime.
Okay.
And despite living in these horrible conditions, he manages to adapt and find little bits of pleasure in his life. Like what? Like a tiny ray of sunshine coming through his cell window, or a kind word from a fellow prisoner.
Wow, so he's finding pleasure even in prison.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you compare him to someone living in a free and prosperous society who might be constantly striving for more and never feeling satisfied,
Right.
well, according to hedonism, Nelson might actually be better off in prison because he's experiencing more pleasure.
That seems messed up.
It does, right, and that's the challenge for hedonism. It doesn't seem right to say that someone is better off in a terrible situation just because they've adapted and are finding some pleasure in it.
Yeah, that doesn't sit well with me at all.
And then there's another famous thought experiment that really challenges hedonism, the experience machine.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this one.
It's a classic. So imagine a machine that can give you any experience you want. It's like a perfect virtual reality where you can live out your wildest dreams,
Okay, so I could be a rock star or an astronaut or whatever I want.
Exactly. And it would feel totally real. You wouldn't even know you were in a machine.
Sounds pretty tempting.
Right. And the question is, would you choose to plug into this machine for the rest of your life?
It's a tough one.
Because on the one hand, you'd be guaranteed constant pleasure. Whatever you desire, you can experience it.
But on the other hand, it's all fake, right?
Exactly. And that's what Robert Nozick, the philosopher who came up with this thought experiment, argued. He said that most people wouldn't want to plug in because they value actually doing things in the real world,
Like achieving real goals, having genuine relationships.
Exactly. Things that you can't get in a simulation.
So even though the experience machine offers maximum pleasure, most people would say no thanks.
Right, and that's a problem for hedonism, because if pleasure is all that matters, then plugging in should be the best option.
But it doesn't feel like the best option.
Exactly. So Nozick's argument is that the experience machine shows that there's more to well-being than just feeling good.
Right. There's something about living a real life that matters.
Exactly.
Okay, so the experience machine is a pretty strong argument against hedonism.
Yeah.
What about PS theory? Does it fare any better?
Well, interestingly enough, standard PS theory actually avoids this problem.
How so?
Well, if someone prefers not to live in a simulation because they value things like authenticity or autonomy, then PS theory would say that not plugging in is better for them.
Because it satisfies their preference.
Exactly. So in this case, PS theory aligns with our intuition that a simulated life isn't necessarily the best life.
Okay, so PS theory dodges that bullet.
Yeah.
But it still has other problems, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely like adaptive preferences, which is kind of a follow-up to the Nelson example.
Adaptive preferences, right? Remind me what that's about.
So remember how Nelson adapted to prison life and found some bits of pleasure?
Yeah.
Well, imagine that after years of this, he actually comes to prefer staying in prison rather than being freed.
Seriously, he'd rather stay locked up.
Yeah, maybe he's scared of the outside world, or he's developed strong bonds with his fellow prisoners or something. And the problem for PS theory is that if well-being is all about satisfying preferences, then it would have to say that staying in prison is better for Nelson.
But that just feels wrong.
Exactly. It doesn't seem right to say that someone who prefers to stay in a bad situation is actually better off there.
So adaptive preferences throw a wrench in the works for PS theory.
They do.
And then there's another problem related to preferences, right?
Yeah.
Something about false beliefs.
Oh yeah, the false belief problem. It's another big one for PS theory. Our sources use the example of Alma to illustrate it.
Okay, what's her deal?
So Alma is trying to decide where to live.
Always a tough decision.
Right. She's got two options, Krellingen, which is a 10-minute walk from university, and Nord, which is a 20-minute bike ride.
Okay.
And Alma prefers Krellingen.
Because it's closer.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Her preference is based on false beliefs.
Like what?
She thinks that Nord has no green spaces, no shops, and that cycling in the Netherlands is super dangerous.
But that's not true.
Not at all. Nord is actually a lovely neighborhood with plenty of parks and shops, and cycling is super safe here.
So if Alma knew the truth, she'd prefer Nord.
Exactly.
But according to regular PS theory, living in Kralingen would be better for her because that's what she currently prefers.
Right, and that's the problem. It seems like her well-being would actually be higher if she lived in Nord, even though she doesn't prefer it right now.
Because her preference is based on a lie.
Exactly. So the false belief problem shows that preferences can't always be trusted as a guide to well-being.
Especially when they're based on bad information.
Right.
But didn't our sources mention something called the revised PS theory? Is that supposed to fix this problem?
Yeah, that's one attempt to deal with these issues. The revised PS theory says that an outcome is better for you if you would prefer it if you were fully informed of all the relevant facts.
Okay, so it's not about your current preferences, but about what you would prefer if you knew everything. So in Alma's case, if she knew the truth about Nord, she would prefer to live there. So according to the revised PS theory, living in Nord would be better for her.
Right, which seems to fit our intuition.
Okay, so that seems to solve the false belief problem.
It does, but even the revised PS theory has its own set of challenges.
Oh no, what now?
Well, one problem is illustrated by the grass counting example, which some people attribute to the philosopher John Rawls.
Grass counting? That sounds pretty random.
I know, right? But imagine that Alma has this weird compulsion to count blades of grass.
Seriously?
Yeah, and even if she knew about all the other amazing things she could be doing with her time, like hanging out with friends or traveling the world, she would still prefer to count grass.
Wow, she must really love counting grass.
She does. And the problem for the revised PS theory is that it would have to say that counting grass is the best thing for Alma because it's her fully informed preference.
But come on, that's ridiculous.
I know it seems pretty absurd to say that someone's life is better if they're just counting grass all day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even when preferences are fully informed, they don't always seem to align with a good life.
Right. They don't.
What else we got?
Well, another challenge is the self-sacrifice example.
Okay, hit me with it.
So picture Alma again, but this time she is a world-famous chef and she's super wealthy.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And Alma has this deep desire to make sure that her great-grandchildren have access to good food. You know, she wants them to be healthy and well-nourished.
That's nice of her.
It is. But here's the catch. She'll never actually meet her great-grandchildren.
Oh.
And she knows that if she donates all her money to set up a trust fund for them, she'll end up struggling herself. You know, maybe even starving.
That's a big sacrifice.
It is. But let's say that even with all this knowledge, she still prefers to give away all her money.
Wow.
So the revised PS theory would say that this is the best thing for Alma because it satisfies her fully informed preference. But it seems strange to say that someone's well-being is tied to the well-being of people. They'll never even meet, you know, people who will live long after they're gone.
Yeah, it feels like her well-being should be more about her own life.
Right, and that's the challenge. It seems like the revised PS theory might be stretching the idea of individual well-being too far.
Okay, what was that last challenge you mentioned?
Yeah.
Something about preferences changing over time.
Oh, yeah, that one's a doozy. It basically highlights the fact that our preferences can change, and that can create some real problems for the revised PS theory.
Give me an example.
Okay, so let's go back to Alma again. This time she's a teenager, and she's furious with her parents. you know?
Teenager's classic.
Right. And in a moment of anger, she decides to do something drastic, like hurt herself.
Oh, no, that's awful.
It is. But the important thing here is that she understands the consequences of her actions. She knows it's going to hurt and she knows it's going to upset her parents. But in that moment of anger, she prefers to do it anyway, as a way to punish them or something.
So even though she knows it's a bad idea, her preference in that moment is to do it anyway.
Exactly. And then later on, when she's calmed down, she totally regrets it. She no longer wants to have hurt herself and she wishes she hadn't done it.
So her preferences have completely flipped.
They have. And this is where the revised PS theory runs into trouble because it's unclear which preference we should take as the true guide to her well-being,
Should we go with her angry preference or her calm preference?
Exactly.
Hmm.
The theory doesn't give us a clear answer to that question.
Okay, so even the revised PS theory has some pretty serious limitations.
Yes.
Now, our sources mention something called laundered preferences as a possible way to deal with some of these problems with PS theory. What's that all about?
So preference laundering is basically an attempt to refine the idea of preference satisfaction by saying that only certain kinds of preferences really count when we're talking about well-being.
Okay, so it's like filtering out the bad preferences.
Kind of, yeah. It's
Okay.
a response to those tricky counterexamples we've been discussing. Like with the angry teenager, we might say that only stable preferences matter. Preferences that are consistent over time.
So we wouldn't base her well-being on her fleeting angry preference.
Exactly. And with the self-sacrifice case, we might say that only preferences that can be satisfied within a person's lifetime should count.
So Alma's preference about her great-grandchildren wouldn't be relevant to her own well-being.
Right. And with the grass counter, we might say that we should focus on the preferences of a mentally healthy version of Alma. Whatever that means.
I see where you're going with this, but it seems kind of problematic to me.
Yeah, definitely raises some red flags.
It's like, who decides which preferences are the good ones and which ones get thrown out?
Exactly. That's the big issue with preference laundering. It risks becoming really paternalistic. Like someone else is deciding what's best for you, even if it goes against your own preferences.
Yeah, that's not cool.
And there's no easy answer to this question. It's a huge debate in philosophy and even in fields like health economics.
So it's an ongoing conversation. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's circle back to that initial idea we mentioned about increased purchasing power leading to greater well-being. Now that we've explored all these different theories, how would we analyze that claim?
Well, as our sources rightly point out, it's not as simple as it might seem. You can't just assume that more money automatically equals a better life according to any of these theories.
Right, because well-being is much more complex than that.
Exactly. From a hedonistic viewpoint, you'd have to show that having more money actually leads to more pleasure, and that's not always the case.
Yeah, you could have all the money in the world and still be miserable.
Exactly. And for PS theory, it would only be true if everyone's top preference was to have more money, which obviously isn't true.
People want all sorts of things.
Right. And for objective theories, it would depend on whether more money actually helps you achieve those objectively valuable things on Nussbaum's list, for example.
So maybe having more money makes it easier to be healthy or to get a good education,
Yeah.
but it doesn't guarantee those things. Okay, so it seems like the relationship between money and well-being is much more nuanced than just a simple equation.
It is. And that's why it's so important to have a clear understanding of what well-being actually is before making claims about how to achieve it.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the content of well-being. We've covered a lot of different theories and challenges, and it's clear that there's no easy answer to the question of what makes a good life.
That's for sure.
Just to recap, we looked at hedonism, which says pleasure is the ultimate good. Then we explored preference satisfaction theory, which focuses on fulfilling desires. And then we delved into objective list theories, like Nussbaum's capability approach, which proposed a set of essential components for a flourishing human life. We also looked at some of the major challenges to these theories, like mental adaptation and the experience machine for hedonism and adaptive preferences, false belief grass, counting self-sacrifice, and changing preferences for PS theory. And finally, we touched on the idea of laundered preferences as a possible way to refine PS theory, but we also acknowledged that it's a very controversial and potentially paternalistic idea.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, but it's definitely worth grappling with these ideas. If you're looking for a more detailed summary of all these theories and some helpful practice questions to test your knowledge, be sure to check out gradeguru.nl.
There you'll find everything you need to ace those exams.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive into the content of well-being.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening.